talk is going to be more specific to NF1 clinical trials. And I was actually having a lot of fun putting together my slides, and I found this template, so you'll have to excuse the green, but I thought it looked really nice for this time of the year. You guys hear me okay or no? No. It's on. Oh. Now can you hear me better? A little bit better? Okay, I can hear myself better, so hopefully. All right, is that good? Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to talk about NF1 clinical trials. So I'm going to basically try and go over some of the clinical trials that are available right now in the region, but also national trials. And then I'm also, before doing that, though, going to go over clinicaltrials.gov because I think this is a really great resource that some of you may or may not have heard of. But I think, it's a place that you can go to learn about clinical trials yourself. So I just want to make sure everybody is familiar with that as well. And then I don't expect to take the entire amount of time, and so at the end, I'm hoping that I can take questions, but we can take questions related to this or basically any NF topic that you have that you just want to ask today. So let's get started. So I think, this morning we talked a lot about clinical trial successes, what we've seen, and how we've been able to move the way that we manage patients with NF1 based on these clinical trials. And so here I just wanted to come up with or sort of show you a summary of what we've seen so far in terms of success in our clinical trials. And the first one that we saw success, and I know Dr. Gross mentioned this just very, very briefly this morning, was the PEG interferon trial where we used PEG interferon, which is actually an injection. It's a shot that modulates the immune system or changes the immune system and how the immune system sort of responds to the tumor itself. And with this, although we didn't get to see shrinkage of the tumor, we did see time to progression delayed. And so people who were taking the PEG interferon found that their tumors grew slower. And there was more time to the time that they would see growth of the tumor. And so for us as a field, that was really important. It was really critical information for us to find or figure out because it really sort of highlighted the impact of the immune system in terms of the tumor and how the tumor grows. And since then, we have found out that, these plexiform neurofibromas or a lot of other tumors that we're seeing, cutaneous neurofibromas, plexiform neurofibromas, optic pathway gliomas, they are about 30-40% tumor cells, and everything else is either an immune cell or something else. So there's not actually a lot of tumor in the tumor. There's a lot of other stuff there. And so how this really sort of impacted our treatments or what we're doing moving forward is it told us you can't just target the tumor, you have to think about everything else as well. And so we started looking then at different types of inhibitors or different type of drugs that would not only impact sort of, again, the tumor cell, but also things around it. And these are drugs that target sort of these pathways. So we keep talking about NF1 and how NF1 is a tumor suppressor and it impacts that pathway. And I think for me, one of the best ways to think about it is that you have a cell, and outside that cell, there are signals trying to get in all the time. It's sort of like if you... I don't know if you were at a Taylor Swift concert, and people were trying to get in the doors, there's always that signal, trying to get in. And what NF1 does is it's supposed to keep those signals from getting in. And so if you have a problem with your NF1, those signals are going to slip in when they're not supposed to. And so tyrosine kinase inhibitors is actually something that blocks the signal before it can get into the door. MEK inhibitors is something that blocks the signal. It gets into the door, but then it sees it's not supposed to be there, and then it kind of bumps it out. So that's kind of a MEK inhibitor. So what we're looking at is drugs that kind of stop these signals, but in different places along the pathway or different positions along the pathway. So Gleevec, one of the tyrosine kinase inhibitors, was one of the things that we looked at next. And it didn't work well on most neurofibromas, but we noticed that for head and neck tumors, we had almost 100% response, which was also pretty impressive. And so this is one of those drugs where if I have somebody who has a tumor of the head and neck and I just can't get it to respond, this is a drug that I will use because it actually was beneficial for that particular location. We know a lot about the MEK inhibitors, selumetinib, binimetinib, mirdametinib, trametinib. I've been lucky enough to be a part of the trials for all 4 of those drugs. They all are very similar in terms of their side effects. They're very similar in terms of the way they act. For all of them, we've seen about 60% of patients who've responded. And we also have found for plexiforms, we've also seen about 40% responders for gliomas. But one thing I do want to mention for MEK inhibitors that was sort of touched on this morning is that it works really great when you're taking it, but it's really hard to come off the medication without seeing some tumor regrowth. And so one of the things that we're trying to work on now is how can we treat with a MEK inhibitor and then come off the MEK inhibitor so you don't have to be on that for your whole life. Cabozantinib is another tyrosine kinase inhibitor. It works just a little differently than Gleevec in terms of how it hits the signal before it goes into the cell. We saw about 40% responders on this, but it is a drug with really bad side effects, so that's something kind of to keep in mind. I do actually still use it for some patients, but we really have to watch the side effects, and you can't be on it for much more than 2 years because it's pretty rough on the gut in particular. And then the last clinical trial success that I have on here is NFX-179, which is a topical MEK inhibitor. This is for cutaneous neurofibromas. It's the first medical treatment we've had for cutaneous neurofibromas. It was a trial that we had 2 different doses of the gel, and then we also had a vehicle, so that's the placebo. And we were able to see shrinkage of the cutaneous neurofibromas, actually in all 3 groups, even the one that was a placebo. But you can see on here that the 1.5% gel, about 44% of people had response versus only like 20% with the vehicle. So there definitely was a signal there. They're trying to bring it to another study just to look at another group of people and make sure that we really understand how this works, especially in terms of the side effects for the medication. So that's another success that we've had. Unfortunately, and I wasn't able to put this on here because I talked about all the different types of trials, we haven't had any really good studies or trials yet that have been able to, through an intervention, significantly improve the cognitive aspects of NF1 yet, the bone aspects of NF1 yet, some of the vascular issues that we see with NF1. So unfortunately, there are some areas of NF1 we haven't made a lot of improvement. And you'll also see that MPNST and some of the high-grade gliomas of some of our more malignant tumors are not on this list either, just because we haven't made a ton of success there as well. But we are working on it. So NF1 clinical trials. So we have clinical trials run through basically, I would say, 3 different groups. You have your Neurofibromatosis Clinical Trial Consortium, so NFCTC is how I refer to that. And that is the one that's funded by the DoD, Department of Defense. And so we'll talk a little bit about the trials through them. You will also have trials that are multi-institution studies. And so essentially you'll have one site that says, I want to look at this, but I don't think I'm going to get enough patients through my site, so let me talk to my partner over here and another partner over there, and we'll just try to open up different sites to make sure we can get enough patients on the study. And then single institution studies. Single institution studies are investigator-driven. You have somebody at the institution who really wants to study something, but they're not quite ready to have it go to multiple institutions. These honestly are the hardest studies to track. You really just have to know somebody at that institution who's doing the trial. So NF Midwest does a really good job picking up the trials in our region at least, but I would encourage you, if that's something that you're interested in for the single institution studies, to really just kind of look into some of the institutions and see what they have posted, because like I said, they're really hard to track. So clinicaltrials.gov. Who here has heard of clinicaltrials.gov? Good. Great. All right. So clinicaltrials.gov is mandatory for any study that is an interventional study. And then actually for some of our sort of natural history studies as well, depending on the type of population and what you're looking at, they might also have to go on to here. And so it's a great reference, again, for physicians who are looking for trials, but also patients who are looking for trials. You go to the clinicaltrials.gov website, and as soon as you get there, there's going to be a place where you can actually search for what you're looking for. And so when I'm looking for trials, I will always use NF1 or NF2, I guess, if that's what you wanted to look for, or whatever the condition or disease would be. So you put that in that spot right there. And then there's a bunch of other different questions. So like, let's say you're looking for a trial, NF1 for neurofibroma. You can actually also search based off of that and get a little bit more specific in terms of the types of trials that come up. And then I always will select studies that are not yet recruiting or recruiting, because if you let everything come up, you might have a trial that's been done for 30 years and that's not really going to do you much good. So you want to really look for stuff that's actually recruiting right now. So I'll always click those two buttons. And then as you keep going down, there's going to be a lot of other options. Most of this, honestly, I'll keep blank because, things like date range. I don't care what the date range is as long as it's something that's active. There is an area here where if you wanted to see if they'll only have male or female, it's really uncommon for that, but, you could do that if you wanted to. Age as well, so if you're looking for a trial specific for adults versus kids, you can actually select the age range here too. And then like this morning when I was talking about study phases, let's say that you really would prefer not to be a part of a phase 1 because you don't know if you're going to get benefit from that, but you would like to do anything from phase 2 and above, you can click on the different phases as well. And then after you're done clicking through all of those things and hitting go, and sorry, this is not the best way of doing it. It'd probably be better to just do it in real time, but you'll get a list. So it'll basically give you a list of all of the different trials that are available based on the search criteria that you put in there. And then once you get to that list, you would then click on a study. So let's say I click on the top study here. And it's going to bring you to the trial itself. And what I love about this is that there's a page there that's designed specifically for people who are looking for trials that aren't necessarily with a medical background. And then there's also things on there for more like on the prescriber side of things. So if you are a physician and you're trying to find a trial for a patient. And so for you, you'd want to go to the study details. It's a little bit more for participants. And it'll give you an overview of the study. You can see what it's testing. You can see sort of what the reasoning behind it is. And then at the very bottom, after you go through all of that information, it'll actually give you who is the person who is the PI of the study, who is the person you can talk to about the study, and their contact information, as well as contact information for somebody else who's associated with that person. And I will tell you, I'm listed as the PI on some of these, and I'm quite busy, but my research associates are a little less busy, so I would say sometimes it's better to reach out to them, honestly, than the PI themselves, but really anybody that's listed on there you can reach out to and say, I'm interested in your study, can you give me more information? So that's clinicaltrials.gov. So now that we know a little bit more about that, I want to go over some of the active trials that are on clinicaltrials.gov for patients with NF1. And I just have this note on here. There are some studies that I know are going to be closing soon, so I did not mention them. And I'm also going to only be mentioning trials that are focused in the United States. But if you ever wanted or were interested in studies in other countries, those are also part of clinicaltrials.gov. So this is the NFCTC. So remember I was telling you about this Neurofibromatosis Clinical Trial Consortium. So one of the things that we realized very early on is that when you have neurofibromatosis type 1, there tend to be centers that have, physicians or people who are interested in it, and they, of course, have access to trials. But then there were people who didn't necessarily have access in parts of the country. And so in 2006, the Department of Defense established this clinical trial consortium, and they funded about 18 sites with 7 affiliate sites so that you could have access to a clinical trial with NF essentially throughout the country. Now, it's not perfect, so I've marked all of the centers that are active or part of NFCTC, and you'll see that there are still some holes in the country or some places where they don't have access to the trials like other areas. But it's much better than what it used to be. And so here in Chicago, of course, we have both Lurie Children's Hospital as well as the University of Chicago. So both of us will have the NFCTC trials available. You can also see at Mayo and some other places. So, a lot of people will ask me if I go to Mayo, will they have something different than what you have? And the answer actually a lot of times is no, because we're both a part of the same trial consortium. We both have the same trials open. So unless they have an investigator-sponsored trial that's not a part of this, we a lot of times do have the same studies. So NF consortium trials. So we have 4 active trials right now. Some of them are opening and some of them are already open. The top one here would be a phase 2 open label study to look at basically HLX1502 in patients with NF1 associated plexiform neurofibromas. So HLX1502 is a new drug. This is one, this morning I was mentioning, you remember that AI approach and how cool it is now that we can actually just feed some stuff in a computer and it's going to kick out something and say this is a drug that we think might work. This is not a MEK inhibitor. It does not actually work like a MEK inhibitor. But this AI program said this is a really cool drug and it might work for NF. It was a urinary tract infection drug back in the day. And so we took that drug from, back in the day that used to treat urinary tract infections. We did some studies on neurofibromas and found that this drug works, at least on the preclinical side, as well as MEK inhibitors in terms of shrinking the tumors, both in cells and in the animal models, and it's extremely safe. You don't have the acne, you don't have actually many of the side effects that we see with the MEK inhibitors. Now, of course, though, we don't know how this works in patients, so we have to go to that step next. And so this is going to be for patients 16 and above who have plexiform neurofibromas. You can have head treatment with MEK inhibitors. You don't have to have head treatment with MEK inhibitors. But I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this works, sort of compared to what we've been seeing with the MEK inhibitors. And this might be something you'll hear about more so in the future if it does do well in the trial. There's also a study looking at selumetinib for prevention. So I did already talk about this earlier today, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but this is that study that I said I was really excited about because what we're doing is we're finding a tumor before it has any symptoms, and we're going to try treating to see if we can prevent those symptoms from happening. So this is a prevention trial, the first prevention trial ever for patients with NF, and I'm super excited about this because I think this is the first of many. I think this is where we need to really go next. We also have a study of cabozantinib and selumetinib. So these are 2 different drugs. So for people who are on a MEK inhibitor, let's say selumetinib, for example, and they're not getting very good response, what this is doing is adding that tyrosine kinase inhibitor cabozantinib and adding it to the selumetinib to see if we get better response. This is actually going to be a phase 1-2 study, so we have to start at phase 1 because we have no idea what doses work together. And so that's going to be the first step, is to figure out the doses, and then we'll move into that phase 2 trial, which is going to allow us to look at it in a larger group of patients. And then the last one that's just going to be opening here soon, we finally got the official approval to open this one, is for MPNSTs. And this is looking at actually 3 different drugs for MPNSTs, a MEK inhibitor plus a bromodomain inhibitor, and then durvalumab, which is a inhibitor that targets the immune system. And so we're taking all different parts of the tumor and we're trying to target them all at the same time to see if we can treat MPNSTs that way. So the rest of the studies that I have here are non-NF consortium studies. So some of these are going to be a little bit more broad in terms of where you can find them. Some of them are going to be very local. For cutaneous neurofibromas, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these, I would say that what's really exciting is that probably about 4 years ago, the Neurofibromatosis Therapeutic Association program said we need to put more money into cutaneous neurofibromas, and so they did. They invested a ton of money in these tumors, and since then we have seen more trials than had ever been available before. And so these 6 trials are available in different areas. The first one, mirdametinib, is a drug, so it's a MEK inhibitor. They're using lower doses of MEK inhibitors to see if that works to treat cutaneous neurofibromas. And then you also have other types of drugs, so there are other types of approaches. So the second one is really looking at how cutaneous neurofibromas form and how can we target that. The third one is photodynamic therapy. And then we're also looking at different types of agents to place on the neurofibromas. So this one is deoxycholic acid, and then I can't say the other one, I apologize, for the treatment of cutaneous neurofibromas. And then we're also looking at skin cooling, and then also if we do repeated sort of treatments, if that works better than just one treatment. So that's sort of what we're seeing with cutaneous neurofibromas. Most of these are available at MGH, so Mass General Hospital, which would be in Boston, but there are a few that could potentially be local, like, for example, the one at Michigan State and Medical College of Wisconsin. For low-grade gliomas, there's really only one trial available right now, and this is that trial that I mentioned earlier today, where we're trying to figure out if selumetinib is better than our standard of care, carboplatin, vincristine. And so this is for patients who were newly diagnosed with a low-grade glioma with NF1, generally between 2 to 21 years of age, but mostly on the lower end of that range. Anublip is one of our new terms that we have now. These are atypical neurofibromatosis neoplasms of uncertain biological potential. So what this is it's a tumor that's not quite a plexiform neurofibroma, but not yet an MPNST. It's sort of in between. It's more malignant than we want it to be, but not super malignant yet. And so we're trying to figure out how to best treat these tumors. And so this study is actually through Johns Hopkins, as well as there's also a site at the NIH, and what they're doing is they're looking at, again, an immune sort of regulated drug, so the CDK4/6 inhibitor, and trying to see if that particular drug gets into the tumor. So this is one of those phase 0 type trials that I was talking about earlier today. So if you're diagnosed with this tumor and you know you have to go to the operating room to have it removed, you can go to get the drug, they'll give you the drug, and then you come and you have your surgery, and then they're looking to see if that actually targeted the tumor or if it's doing anything for the tumor. So that's kind of what this trial is for. There's also a trial for JMML, so I don't know if any of you have heard of this. It's juvenile myelomonocytic leukemia. It's one of the very, very rare types of leukemias that you can see with NF1. There is actually a trial looking at trametinib and azacitidine for these patients. This trial has been open for quite some time just because it's so rare, but I do think that it's going to give us an option or a better option to treat patients with this particular tumor. And then for cognitive studies, so again, there's not a lot of interventional studies. Most of what we see for cognitive studies are more gathering data or information about patients and what we really need to understand for cognition so then we can go into interventional. This is one of our interventional studies that is available. Many of you probably heard about the lovastatin studies that were done a while back, and you heard that the lovastatin didn't actually really improve cognition as well as we were hoping that it would. This study is looking at it in a little different way. So it's actually the dose is a little bit different and the timing of the way that they give it is a little bit different, just to see if maybe that's why we weren't seeing the response that we were hoping to see before. So this is one of the cognitive studies that we have. And then for pain, so we're, for the first time, having a study for pain in NF, which I am really, really excited about. I actually helped to develop this trial because I think that it's so important for us to better understand how to manage and treat pain in patients who have NF1, whether it be with a tumor or without a tumor. And so what this is doing is it's actually looking at biomarkers of pain, so to help us assess pain, and then better understand what it is physiologically that's causing that pain. So I think one of the issues with NF1 is that we don't actually know why patients have pain a lot of the times. We'll blame it on the tumor or the compression of this or that, but we don't really fully get why patients with NF1 are more likely to have pain. The pain is going to impact you in a lot of different ways. And so this is trying to help tease out exactly what nerves are affected and exactly how does that cause the pain. And so they're using a machine that actually measures pupil response, so like your dilation and constriction of your pupil. And it's not horrible, but they'll cause a little bit of pain and they'll look to see how the pupil responds. And based on how the pupil responds, it can tell us which nerves are affected, which I think is really, really cool. So I'm hoping that this also moves beyond the NIH after they're done with their initial studies. And then I want to very briefly, we're going to have a wonderful talk this afternoon on biomarker studies, so I don't want to talk too much about it, but I do want to mention a few of the biomarker studies that are out there. You'll hear about the top one here. We do have the one that you just heard about, which is the second one here for genetic modifiers and how to kind of figure out genetics and cutaneous neurofibromas. But then there's also biomarker studies helping us really try to find markers that can tell us, is there something that's a little bit more aggressive in terms of how the tumor is behaving? And how can we identify tumors that are acting the way that they're not supposed to before they cause problems. So there's a lot of different things that we can look at in terms of the biomarkers. There's also biomarker studies for early detection of tumors, biomarker studies, again, for that malignant conversion. One thing I do want to say for biomarkers is that, when you go see your doctor now, there's a very strong chance that you might be asked to become a part of a a study that basically allows for biobanking. So this is biomarkers, but you might hear that word biobanking. And I'm sure anybody who've ever had surgery or had a loved one who had surgery, or even sometimes just go to the doctor and you blood draw, they might ask you about biobanking. The reason that we do these biobanking studies is it allows us to collect blood that was collected, or tissue or whatever it be, that was collected for another reason, and then use it for biomarker studies without having to go to you to ask you to give us another sample. So if you're going to the doctor and you're getting blood tests anyway, you're going to get your blood test done, but then there's extra blood, and what we always do is we just throw it away, and it goes in the garbage, and it goes to a big pit somewhere, and it doesn't really do any good for anything. And so what these biomarkers or biobanking studies have done is it's allowed us to bank and or store the samples, and then let's say that I'm sitting in my lab, and I say, you know what, I've noticed that I'm seeing this particular marker in, patients who have NF1 and MPNSTs, for example. I would like to see if this is actually seen in more than just one patient. I can go to the bank and I can actually screen sort of the samples without having to go to each patient individually and ask for another sample. And it allows for us to kind of take our ideas and move them forward a little bit faster than it would be if we had to recruit patients specifically for that. So just a little plug for biobanking studies. If you are ever asked, I would say definitely agree to it unless there's a reason that you don't want to, but it really does help with research in NF. And then we talked a lot about natural history studies earlier this morning too, so I just want to tell you that we have natural studies now in this area for optic pathway gliomas, for just regular gliomas, the cutaneous neurofibroma natural history study, which you heard about, and then also natural history in terms of how the plexiform neurofibromas may potentially become MPNSTs. And then there's just a couple others on here. So I had to throw this one in here because I am very, very, very strongly interested in metabolism and nutrition in NF. And I think that we need to better understand how sort of the food and energy and things that we eat maybe potentially influence how patients with NF feel in general, but also potentially how it influences tumors. And so I'm working on that in my lab. I don't have a study yet, but in Minnesota, they do have a study looking at curcumin and olive oil and trying to see if this combination of sort of natural supplements can help to improve on some of the symptoms that patients with NF1 have. So we are definitely trying to better understand how diet influences how you feel with NF1, but also, in the future, I think we're going to also look at how that influences tumor growth, and some of the other things that we see within NF. And then there's this decentralized clinical trial. So this is the one we talked about a little bit earlier with Dr. Merker, where what she's trying to do is have patients who have NF that don't necessarily have a center of excellence, sort of get information about NF to bring to their provider and see if we can improve on care by doing that. And then I'm going to throw in there again, you've heard this multiple times, but I want to put another plug for the NF Tumor Foundation registry studies. Register for their, the CTF registry. There's a ton of questionnaires and things that come from that. There's a ton of data that can be learned from that. So I would encourage everyone here to sign up for it. So how do I learn results of clinical trials? Because this is one of the questions that I get a lot, and I think it's a really good question. You just spent a lot of time in a clinical trial, you gave samples, you got MRIs done, you took a drug, you had side effects, all of that stuff. Like, how do you learn the results? So your treating physician probably will have some results once they're available, so you can always ask your physician. Depending on the trial, publication or press releases are definitely something to look for. I can tell you that not too many people like to publish their study if it didn't work. So if it didn't work, you might not see it in the press, but certainly if it did, you will. Clinicaltrials.gov, so one of those tabs there actually has the results of the study. So once that's available, you have to update clinicaltrials.gov and put the results in there. So that's another place you can find the results. And then I would say just coming to meetings like this, Family Forums, NF Midwest Info Fair, Children's Tumor Foundation has an NF Summit, and then they also have a place on their website where you can find results of clinical trials as well. That's definitely a good place to find that. So in summary, I would say since the 2000s, the number and type of clinical trials that we have for NF1 related symptoms has definitely improved, some with benefit. There are still some aspects of NF that we need trials for, and so I would encourage you to continue to advocate for yourselves, advocate for your loved ones. The more you say you need something done, the more likely it's going to get done. Most of the clinical trials are posted on clinicaltrials.gov, and of course that includes information on who to contact. And then I also have on here that your treating physician should have information, but never hesitate to reach out beyond your treating physician if you don't feel like they're giving the information that you need. So with that, I'm going to take questions, and I can't remember how much time I have, but questions related to this or just general questions that you might have.
We have 15 minutes.
Ooh.
I have questions. Nobody has questions? I have to remember my questions. So, come on, you're going to come up with a question, Miranda. I know it. All right, so one of my questions was, you said about some of the things not being published if they failed.
Yeah.
But those are published somewhere for scientists and researchers, right? I mean, they need to know what fails. Or they're maybe not published in a journal, but they're somewhere.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're getting better about that. So it really used to be that if a study didn't work or if a trial didn't work, it didn't get published, and you just never knew. And so one of the things that we found is that people were repeating the same thing over and over and over again, and everybody was getting a negative result. And the more we didn't publish, the more time and energy we wasted on something that wasn't necessarily helpful. And so there was a huge push not too long ago to try and get negative studies published. And one of the things that happened with that sort of initiative is that journals, so one of the things is that when you're doing a study, or when you're, whether it be on a clinical side or on the research side, and you're trying to publish it in a journal, the journal has to decide if it's excited about it or not. And there's a lot of journals that would say, if it's not positive and exciting data, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And so then you would send it to journal after journal after journal, and they would reject. So then you just didn't bother try. So there are specific journals now that will take negative studies, which I'm really, really happy about. And one of them is the American Journal of Medical Genetics, which will definitely publish negative studies for neurofibromatosis. So we're getting better in terms of publishing that. But yeah, for a long time there, we didn't, it just disappeared. You never knew what happened. So you would just assume it was probably a negative study, but you don't always know for sure.
Oh, there's a question. You didn't took my chance to ask the question away. What?
Yeah.
My question is, have you heard anything about the measles vaccine trial up in Mayo?
About what?
Measles vaccine.
The measles vaccine trial. Yeah. So the measles vaccine trial is for MPNST. Which is more of the malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumors. And right now, there's actually vaccine trials for a lot of different tumors, not necessarily with NF, but a lot of different types of tumors. And what we're trying to figure out is the right dose for that measles vaccine to be able to give to patients to then see if we can actually get some benefit from it. So that specific measles vaccine trial right now is still in that dose finding. It's still the phase 1, basically the dose finding range. So I haven't heard anything really positive about it yet, but it's not necessarily because it won't be. It's just that we haven't gotten beyond figuring out how the virus is working to see if it actually can treat the tumors. And as of now, you have to have an MPNST for that particular measles virus study, yes. There are, and I know because I've been a part of a few of these, there are initiatives to try to figure out vaccines for other types of tumors associated with NF, in particular the low-grade gliomas and the plexiform neurofibromas. But one of the difficulties that we're having is that, so the measles these vaccines a lot of times have to target something. There has to be a way for it to hone to the tumor. And the optic pathway tumors and plexiform neurofibromas and a lot of the other tumors with NF don't necessarily have a target for it to hone to. And so now we're having to go back to say, what can we use as a target? And so we're doing studies to figure that out. But when you have NF, there's actually changes in your immune system just in general. And so one of the things we figured out very quickly is that, it used to be for patients, let's say with breast cancer, some of the other cancers that we're trying to use vaccines for, you would just take a, healthy cohort of patient or, healthy group of women who don't have breast cancer, and then you take women who do have breast cancer, and you look for specific, signals in the blood that tells you how the immune system's working, and then you can develop a vaccine based on that. But when you look at patients with NF in general, they have changes in their immune system. And so what we're really trying to tease out now is what is the change in general for patients with NF compared to those that have the tumors. And MPNST so far has been the one tumor that's given us the best signal, which is why most of what you're going to see so far is based off of that particular tumor type. That was probably way more complicated than it needed to be, but that's sort of why we're specifically targeting that tumor right now.
Anybody else, or do I get to go again? Okay. Well, first of all, I was just checking with Heather, that nutracutical one in Minnesota. We checked in on that, and they're full.
Oh, is it full now?
Yeah, it's full.
Okay, never mind.
The olive oil one, because I know that's the one we're all like, yeah, let's go do that. So talking a little bit about journal and publications, we talked about this. We wanted to try and have a session on understanding research, because now everybody can find these journals and articles and abstracts on the internet, and we see people popping up in Facebook or whatever and posting, I saw this, that you can do this, and it's maybe a case study or something. Yeah. And I know we can't go into that now, but I don't know if we can say something briefly about, how, I don't know if we can do it briefly, or if we're going to have to do a webinar. We talked about doing a webinar on it, but how we can digest it a little more carefully, or just words of warning about being really careful.
I mean, I think words of warning, you're absolutely right. So people post what they want to post, and they will post all sorts of stuff. So I have had people come to me who will say, I found online that, somebody had their child go into a hyperbaric oxygen chamber and it cured them of their tumors. Can I do that too? And that's not safe. And so I think, some of what you see online, maybe that person feels very strongly that this was a treatment or something that cured their child, but it's not always the best thing for us to do. And so, when you're looking at things online, or when you're looking at postings online, or people are really excited about things, I think one of the things I would say is that if it's only one person and one child or one something out there, it's probably not something that you would typically use. But I would also say, too, the source is very, very important. And so there are, like the Children's Tumor Foundation or NF Midwest, there are groups that are out there that will actually sort of weed through, like, what is something that we should tell you about, and what is something that is out there but probably not really something that is legitimate. And so, definitely using those websites to find kind of your source of information, or at least the initial source of information, is a really good way to initially approach it.
Well, so this isn't a question. I just wanted to add to that, because so many people know what PubMed is now, and it's, it was on PubMed, And even if something is a published paper, even if it's a publication that has been accepted at a journal, there are different types of journals. Some of them are a lot more rigorous in what they accept than others. But there's also different types of studies. There's studies that look at all the other studies. There's studies that report cases that were just one person. So just because something is published in a journal, it doesn't mean that it's valid, right? So just be very cautious using those other sources. And just another plug for, we're really trying to get this information to where it is more accessible by the patient community, particularly with things like ChatGPT and stuff out there. We know that people are going to these places, and it's definitely not the best source for information. But there is an effort to try to get information in a way that patients can access it quicker. It just takes a while because these tools are challenging. So we're doing it on a small scale, but trying to learn how to do it on a larger scale where patients do have more access to that.
One of those, that you talked about, I think it was the UTI drug, is
Yes.
starting as a phase 2. Are they able
Yes.
to skip phase 1 because it's already?
Yeah, so that one got to
How-
skip phase 1
Okay.
because the dose was already established in a urinary tract infection sort of setting. So that's where, again, I was telling you, like, you can use whatever's out there and then be able to move to the next phase as long as you can show that it's safe in the population. And the one really cool thing about that drug, too, is that, I mean, again, if everything we did preclinically holds out, it does seem to have a longer lasting effect as well. It doesn't have that same type of rebound, at least preclinically. So we're crossing our fingers. And I mean, like I said, I don't know what's going to happen once we use it, but it's hopefully going to be something else that we can use for patients with NF and these tumors. And, you know, people always ask me too, like, well, you've already got MEK inhibitors and you've already got all these drugs. Why are you looking for something else? And the reason is because those drugs don't work for everybody. They're not permanent for everybody. And so we still need something else. Like we need something for every single patient. And even if there's only 5 patients that are left off because the MEK inhibitor didn't work, those 5 patients deserve something. So I think that we're going to be continuously doing research and always trying to find the next big thing because we want to make sure every single patient has the best care possible.
That leads to my next question. Do you think as people are using selumetinib and mirdametinib gets approved, will it be harder to do some of these other trials because you won't have the people to do it?
Yeah, it is, and it already is a lot harder to do the trials because you get on the MEK inhibitor and you feel really good while you're on it. And so we actually had one of the studies I didn't talk about today, but we had a study for low-grade gliomas in patients with NF1 with a drug called poly-ICLC, so another one of those immune type of modulating drugs. And we actually had it open for almost 5 years and only got 3 participants because everybody was on a MEK inhibitor. And so it was really hard to say, I understand that the MEK inhibitor is stabilizing things for you, but this might be better, you know, because when it's working, when what you're on is working, you know, a lot of times you don't want to change, you don't want to switch, you don't want to come off of it, and so we are definitely having more trouble recruiting people to drug trials that are not MEK inhibitor trials just because of that. So I'm not saying don't use a MEK inhibitor, but I do, yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's a really good problem to have. So
but it's a
definitely,
little worrisome because maybe there's something better, but how are you going to
yeah,
get the people?
Exactly, that's exactly it. We
unless,
just don't
you know.
know what might be better.
Oh, we have a question over here. Well, we need it because it won't record your question. It will not hear you.
So if you have been one of the clinical trials, like for a MEK inhibitor or something else, will that preclude you from being involved in another clinical trial for a different drug? You know, like saying because you've already gotten this boost from this, would it preclude you from something else that they want to see a pure,
Yeah.
different thing?
Yep, so that's a good question. So in the past, when we would design clinical trials, we would exclude people who had been on a different clinical trial. What we've learned now is that you don't have to exclude people. You just have to give a washout period. And so if you've been on a MEK inhibitor, I believe for this upcoming study, you just have to have been off it for 3 months, and then you can go on to that study. And so it allows us then to have patients who were on one clinical trial that didn't maybe work as well for them as we had hoped to then go on to another trial and see if maybe we can get a response with that trial. So yeah, so for most of the new trials that we have now, we don't have that exclusion anymore. You just have to figure out what that washout period is. Yeah.